The arrivals hall at O'Hare International Airport was packed. The wheels of suitcases rolled across the marble floors, the announcements overlapped, and the exhaustion was evident on every face. Naomi Sinclair, a veteran federal agent, had just boarded a nearly 3-hour flight from Washington, D.C. She wore a smart charcoal business suit, her long black hair tied back, and the familiar sharp gaze of someone accustomed to quickly assessing any situation. But right now, all she wanted was to get back to her quiet apartment in Chicago. Naomi was waiting for her luggage when a shrill scream tore through the air. "Oh my God, where's my wallet?" Everyone turned. A white woman in her 60s, stylishly dressed, glittering in designer goods and diamonds, was frantically rummaging through a giant Hermes bag. Her name was Eleanor Holloway, a name Naomi would later learn. When she couldn't find her purse, Eleanor glanced around. Her gaze stopped, as if frozen, on Naomi, the only black woman standing nearby. You took my wallet!" Eleanor pointed at Naomi, her voice as sharp as a knife. Naomi froze. A moment of silence. "Excuse me?" Her voice was low and calm, surprisingly professional. "I don't know what you're talking about. Maybe you should check your pockets again." "Stop acting! You were right next to me when you got off the plane. I saw it. You were in my pocket." The accusation landed like a sledgehammer. The surrounding passengers began to whisper, many of them looking at Naomi with a mixture of suspicion and contempt. The silence was toxic. Naomi tried to catch her breath. "You're making a terrible mistake," she said, her voice still steady. "I'm a federal agent. If you're not sure, I suggest calling security to handle the process." But no one listened. No one. 3 airport police officers quickly appeared, their faces grim. They hadn't asked Naomi a single question, hadn't asked Eleanor to confirm any details, just the color of her skin and the sound of her panicked cries to act. "Put your hands behind your back," one officer barked, as coolly as if he were arresting an armed robber. "You're under arrest for suspicion of theft." Naomi held up her hands, but her eyes burned. "I'm a federal agent. I have a badge and a badge." "We'll check later," the officer snapped, signaling to his partner. Cold handcuffs were clasped around Naomi's wrists. She was spun around, pushed forward, under the shocked and some amused eyes of the crowd. People pulled out their phones to film. No one spoke. No one asked who she was. "This is a mistake," Naomi repeated. But her words hit a wall. When the police searched her bag, Naomi didn't resist. She knew the law, she knew the procedure, and she knew the truth would come out soon. And then, they didn't find Eleanor's wallet. Instead, they pulled out a card, a federal agent's card, bearing the name Naomi Sinclair. Along with it, a shiny FBI badge. The 3 men fell silent, their faces paled. A deadly silence fell across the crowded airport lobby. And Eleanor, the woman who had made the false accusation, looked around in confusion, but no one came to her rescue. What happened next? No one could have predicted. The chaos that erupted in the airport lobby like a sudden surge quickly caught the attention of 3 nearby police officers. They moved through the crowd with high alert, their eyes scanning each face. Leading the way was Officer Dave Rohr, a white man in his 40s with salt and pepper hair and tanned skin, exuding an air of experience, but no less arrogance. In his cold eyes was judgment rather than concern. Close behind was Officer Kevin Riley, a young man still immature, his eyes sparkling with youthful suspicion. Walking to the right was Officer Maria Sanchez, the only woman in the group, in her 30s with sharp eyes and a professional appearance, somewhat more reserved than her 2 male colleagues. The 3 of them moved quickly toward the crowd gathered around the 2 women. Naomi, a black woman who was trying to keep her composure, and Mrs. Holloway, a well-dressed white woman, her eyes red from crying, who was speaking and pointing dramatically. "What's going on here?" Rohr said, his voice booming, authoritative as a verdict. He glanced at Mrs. Holloway and then stopped at Naomi with a cold gaze. Mrs. Holloway spoke quickly, her voice cracking with emotion. "The police! Thank God, it was her. She took my wallet when we got off the plane. There was cash, credit cards. She picked it up and hid it. Arrest her." The accusation spread like oil on a fire. No evidence, no questions asked. Rohr turned to Naomi, his face full of suspicion and contempt. His voice was sharp as a knife. "You heard me. Hand over the wallet. Now don't make us have to be rough." The blood rushed to Naomi's face. Her heart was pounding. She looked at Roar, who had clearly taken sides before she'd even heard the story. "Officer," she said, trying to keep her voice from shaking, "I didn't take anything from anyone. You can check her luggage or the security cameras at the gate. I'm completely innocent." Roar let out a faint laugh, a dangerous laugh. "Oh, and you want to check the cameras? This is an old trick. You think I haven't seen your kind before? Dressing up to fool people and then pickpocketing at the airport? I know that kind of thing." His words fell like a knife, condemning her not just with words but with the color of her skin. Riley nodded behind her, saying nothing but her eyes following the instructions. Sanchez frowned, her lips pursed, but she still made no protest. Naomi took a deep breath. The humiliation weighed heavily, but she did not back down. "Officer Roar," she said, her eyes fixed on him, her voice low but icy. "You are making unfounded accusations, displaying racist attitudes, and insulting my dignity. I demand that you act professionally and respect my civil rights." The words were like a slap in Roar's face. He flushed. "You dare lecture me on professionalism? Someone like you talking about civil rights? You have no right to do that. Not while you're striding around in public?" The air was thick, the tension peaking. He turned to Riley and Sanchez. "Handcuff her for theft and resisting arrest. Take her to the station." Naomi backed away, horrified but unyielding. "You have no right to do this. I'm innocent. No one saw me do anything. There were no cameras, no evidence." But her words were like wind blowing through stone. Riley and Sanchez approached, their faces cold. Naomi struggled desperately. "I'm not resisting. Don't touch me." The brief but intense struggle took place in full view of everyone. Phones were raised, recording every moment. Finally, Naomi was pinned down. The handcuffs snapped shut behind her. The cold metal clicked, ringing like an invisible accusation. Her wrists hurt. She was pushed through the crowd's gazes, humiliated like a criminal. Not for her actions, but for her presence at the wrong time. And her skin color was not accepted. Mrs. Holloway stood there, her face beaming with malicious satisfaction. For her, justice had been served, regardless of the truth. Naomi was handcuffed, her eyes still shining brightly on the man standing before her. Roar. He looked her up and down with a triumphant gaze as if he had just won the greatest victory of his life. "Can you still talk loudly now?" He smirked, his voice dripping with honey and satisfaction. "In prison, you will have plenty of time to think about stealing." He turned back, signaling Riley and Sanchez. "Take her away." Naomi gritted her teeth, her eyes red, but she did not let a single tear fall. She knew she had to stay calm. It could not end like this. She could not let the truth be buried under the cloak of abusive power. But just as Riley and Sanchez were about to drag her away, Roar stopped her, a sudden and somewhat suspicious gesture. Maybe he wanted to find more evidence to confirm the arrest, or simply wanted to drown her in humiliation once more. "Wait," Roar said, his voice razor-sharp. "Find her. The wallet must be hidden somewhere. Sanchez, you do it." He didn't want to lay a hand on Naomi, out of protocol, or perhaps out of fear that he would lose control if she looked past his arrogant facade. Sanchez moved closer, her expression awkward, but she did as she was told. Naomi said nothing. She straightened her back, her eyes cold and stoic as Sanchez dug into her coat pockets. The officer's fingers brushed against something solid, metal. She paused, then slowly pulled out a small black leather wallet, not a regular wallet. Sanchez opened the wallet. Inside, under the clear plastic, were no credit cards or cash. There was a shiny gold badge, a delicately engraved eagle with the words, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Next to it was an ID card with a clear photo and name, Agent Naomi Sinclair. Sanchez's entire body stiffened as if struck by lightning. Her eyes widened, her lips quivering in shock. She turned to look at Roar and Riley, her voice breaking. "Boss, look! Look at this!" She held up the wallet. The badge glinted in the light. Riley and Roar stepped forward. At the sight of the FBI emblem, their faces froze. The triumph they had just seen was shattered in an instant, replaced by unconcealed horror. Roar stared at the badge, then looked up at Naomi. His face was pale, his lips trembling. No, no way. This is fake, right? He stammered, his words catching in his throat. Riley was even worse. His limbs began to shake. His gaze was fixed on his hand, where a few minutes ago he had emotionlessly cuffed a federal agent. Fear filled the air. All three of them knew now. They had not only arrested the wrong person, they had insulted, humiliated, and arrested an FBI agent. The consequences would go far beyond any internal punishment. They were facing the loss of their jobs, prosecution, even jail time. Roar collapsed to his knees before Naomi, all his pride crumbling like a sandcastle in the ocean. Agent Sinclair, I'm sorry, he said, his voice filled with tears and despair. This is a misunderstanding, a terrible mistake. We really didn't know who you were. He turned sharply on Riley and Sanchez, shouting in panic. What are you doing standing there? Take off the cuffs, now! Do you really want to go to jail? Riley and Sanchez, startled, rushed to uncuff Naomi, their fingers trembling, their eyes averted as if they dared not face the woman they had just insulted, and awakened from their own nightmare. The key shook in their hands as they tried to open the cuffs. The metallic clank rang out deafeningly. The cuffs were still tight around Naomi's wrists, leaving red marks on her skin. Meanwhile, Roar continued to plead, her voice almost breaking. Please, please, it was her. That woman. Misinformation. Please forgive us. Don't report this, please. We'll lose everything. Naomi didn't respond. She stood still, letting them uncuff her, each movement slow, unhurried. Once her wrists were free, Naomi slowly rubbed the reddened skin. Her face was expressionless, cold, emotionless, completely devoid of forgiveness or sympathy. The humiliation and simmering anger were still there, but now covered by the calm of someone who knew she had the upper hand. Naomi said nothing, just stretched, adjusting her slightly askew suit jacket. She took her wallet from Sanchez's, still shaking hand, and quietly placed it back in her jacket. Her steely gaze swept over the three policemen who stood cowering, as if waiting for the final verdict. But Naomi didn't scold or threaten. She didn't need it. Her silence was enough to make the air thick with tension, ready to explode. She didn't waste another second pulling her work phone from her pocket. Every move she made was precise, controlled. Roar, Riley, and Sanchez held their breaths, their eyes glued to every little gesture. They didn't know who Naomi was calling, but their instincts told them this wouldn't end well. Naomi's fingers moved quickly across the screen. She raised the phone to her ear. This is Agent Naomi Sinclair, her voice said evenly, not high but full of weight. I'm at O'Hare International Airport, Gate B32. There's been a serious incident involving 3 police officers. Their names are Roar, Riley, and Sanchez. She told the story briefly without adding emotion, but each word was cold and precise. The charges were clear: theft, racial bias, abusive language, ignoring evidence, illegal searches, and handcuffs. She ended the call with a simple but decisive request. I need someone in authority here to handle this immediately. She hung up, not another word, just a stare, cold, sharp, commanding. The 3 officers paled, frozen in a silence that weighed more than any scolding. Minutes later, like a storm summoned, a man in plain clothes walked in with 2 senior officers. It was Chief Michael Thompson. His face was stern, his gaze sharp. Perhaps he and Naomi had worked together in the past, or at least knew each other's reputations. Agent Sinclair, are you okay? He asked, his voice low and heavy with worry. I'm fine, Michael, Naomi replied, her voice calm but tinged with obvious annoyance. Thompson nodded, turning to his 3 subordinate officers. He didn't need to ask any more questions. It was all too clear. Badges, weapons, radios, hand them over, he ordered. You're suspended on the spot, pending an internal investigation. No argument, no glances. The 3 officers bowed their heads, walking shakily like men who had just heard the death knell of their careers. The 3 men stood disarmed, frozen in the cold airport corridor, their eyes vacant, as if stripped of the power they had once abused. They had been stripped of it, not by force but by truth. The senior officers returned to the scene. Chief Thompson stepped forward, his face tense, and for the first time, his voice trembled as he spoke. "Naomi, I am truly sorry." He paused, took a deep breath, then turned to the agent. "On behalf of the entire Chicago Police Department, I apologize for this shameful and unacceptable behavior. This was a serious incident, and it is completely contrary to the policies and values we stand for." Agent Sinclair nodded silently. Her eyes held a steely look. Thompson continued, her voice firm. "I pledge to conduct a fair, thorough internal investigation and to be unsparing in dealing with those involved." Seconds later, another airport security officer came running in, holding a beige purse. "Mrs. Holloway," he called. The woman turned, her eyes wide with surprise. "We just found your purse. It was stuck at the bottom of your bag. It may have been hidden by other items." Mrs. Holloway was stunned. With trembling hands, she took the purse back, opened it. Everything was there. Nothing was missing. Her eyes moved silently from Naomi to the officers, her face showing confusion and a delayed shame. Her accusation, wrong. Thompson tilted his head, sighed, his eyes heavy with the absurd complexity of it all. He turned to Naomi. "We'll take you to a more private place to give you a detailed report." Again, he repeated earnestly, "I'm sorry." Naomi nodded. Justice had been served, but she knew this was only the beginning. An internal CPD investigation was immediately launched, overseen by Chief Thompson and represented by the FBI Office of Professional Responsibility. Agent Sinclair was the key witness. She recounted every detail, every violation, from the officers jumping to unfounded conclusions, to Rohr's blatant bias, to the discriminatory treatment that disregarded basic due process. Most important, the video from Rohr, Riley, and Sanchez's personal cameras. The irrefutable evidence, it captured it all. Naomi's arrogance, her contempt for her explanations, and her brutal handcuffing. It also captured the moment when the three men, upon seeing their FBI badges, became brazenly cowardly and fearful. Even Ms. Holloway, though not the primary suspect, could not escape the evidence that exposed the seriousness of her accusation. Rohr, Riley, and Sanchez eventually admitted to their violations. Rohr tried to blame the pressure of the job and faulty professional instincts, while Riley and Sanchez said they were just following orders, though they also admitted they did not intervene or question the wrongful orders. The investigation's conclusion was clear. The three had committed a series of serious violations of professional rules and ethics: abuse of power, false arrest, discrimination, unprofessional conduct, and violating the civil rights of a federal agent. But when it came to deciding on disciplinary action, Chief Thompson and the CPD board had to consider a number of factors: pressure from the police union, existing reform policies, and the desire to come up with a constructive, rather than punitive, solution. And so they came to a decision, not entirely surprising but certainly heartbreaking. They could have faced criminal charges. Given what happened at O'Hare, the actions of the three officers, Rohr, Riley, and Sanchez, were clearly criminal. They were referred to the Office of Criminal Justice. But after intense discussions, both internally and with pressure from the union, a remarkable decision was made: no criminal charges. Instead, what was billed as extreme probation was imposed, both as a warning and as a last chance to make amends. A year of unpaid suspension. Riley and Sanchez, though not directly involved in the incident like Rohr, were considered complicit. They would be suspended from their badges for 12 months, with no pay, no privileges. Everything was suspended, to allow them to feel the emptiness that their victims had felt. Rohr, who led the charge, faced total isolation within the force, a silent condemnation. All three were then forced to undergo a special retraining program, a full year long, closely monitored by the FBI and civil society. It was more than a course in job skills. It was a journey of coming to terms with themselves. The course covered thorny topics: knowledge of federal and state laws, civil rights, and the limits of police power. managing emotions and anger in real-world situations, respectful communication skills, even when provoked, identifying and combating unconscious bias, race, class, gender, simulating real-world situations, talking to communities hurt by police violence, writing personal essays about past mistakes, forcing them to put them into words, not to hide, all under the watchful eyes of psychologists and independent counselors. If they repeat any wrongdoing during this process or fail their final evaluations, they will be permanently dismissed from the force with no chance of reinstatement. At the FBI Chicago office, Agent Naomi Sinclair sits in front of a large window, looking out at the hazy city outside. The investigative report on the airport incident is still on the screen. She reads each line, her emotions mixed. Relief, that justice has at least spoken, but also bitter doubt. Will a year of badge suspension and a few hundred hours of retraining be enough? Can something as ingrained as racial bias and blind faith in authority be erased with a single class? Will Riley and Sanchez, who were silent when things went wrong, have the courage to speak up when things happen again? Or was this just a political half measure, a way to avoid firing them, and even more so, taking them to court? Naomi knew, if it weren't for the FBI badge on her chest, she would have been a victim that day at the airport, handcuffed, accused. No one would listen to her explanation, and maybe for the rest of her life, she would be branded with a stigma she didn't create. Justice in America was still a privilege, not a given, and that burned into her every day. Those without badges, without power, without a voice, who would protect them when people like Roar were being re-educated? She sighed. The feeling of powerlessness was familiar, but never pleasant. Naomi turned back to her computer screen. She had work to do, because this fight wasn't over, because justice, truly fair and equal, was still a long, bumpy, lonely road.